Looking forward to 2018. I guess you can't really look forward to anything without having a perspective of looking back as well. So maybe you should spend a minute or two just thinking about what did you do in 2017? What did you achieve? Did you oil your deck? Did you organise your garden? Maybe do some renovations on the house, organise a holiday? Maybe you went on a holiday. What did you do for the Lord? What did any of us do for Jesus in the last year? And that ought to give us some perspective of what we should aim to do for Jesus in the future. You know, God really does need our help. Not suggesting for one moment that the God of the universe is in any way unable to achieve any goal he wants, but he's asked our help. Matthew chapter 19, Jesus says to his followers, look around, the harvest is plentiful. There are lots of people out there who want to know about the Lord Jesus Christ. They want to hear the gospel. And then Jesus says to them, but the trouble is the labourers are few. Pray then to the Lord of the harvest that he might send out labourers into the field. Oh, that's you and I. We are the ones who've been asked to go out, either in this year or whenever the opportunity presents. We're the ones who've been asked to go out and serve Jesus Christ by spreading the message of his gospel, who might be able to bring as many as we can to salvation. Well, sometimes you look at the people in the Bible and you think to yourself, well, I'm not like them. They obviously had greater faith or greater ability, or were put in a circumstance which was greater and different to the circumstance I find myself in. I don't think I could be a Deborah or an Esther or a Moses or an Abraham or a David. Surely those sort of people are different to what I am. And that's not true. And you know in your heart it's not true. James, the Lord's brother, says that Elijah was a human being just like us. He was exactly the same, and he prayed to God that it wouldn't rain on the earth for 3.5 years, and it didn't. Then after that he prayed again that it would rain, and it did. The important thing I think that I want to talk about at the moment is that James' words there is simply saying that Elijah was just like us. Elijah probably thought that he wasn't going to be a Deborah or wasn't going to be an Abraham. But he found himself by choice in a circumstance where he served God. And I want to just have a look at the moment how you can be not only equal to a prophet of the Lord, but greater. I want to take a little example today of someone who turned out to be greater than the prophets. And they were just an ordinary person. I don't even know their name. Let's have a look at the story of Elijah first of all. Pick it up at 1 Kings 19. You haven't got to read it. 1 Kings 19 is that story about poor old Elijah. He had just called fire down from heaven on Mount Carmel and consumed the sacrifices. He'd presented the people of Israel with proof that Yahweh was the real God and that Baal was no gods at all. And the very next day he seems to be on the run because Jezebel's after his blood. He might have thought that the people of Israel would have stood up for him. But no, he found himself by himself, and he ran for his life down to Beersheba in the very south. And he got there and he fell asleep thinking, I'm no better than my ancestors. All the prophets before me failed, and I failed. And when he woke, there was an angel with him. He said, have some food, have some drink, you've got a long journey. So he had something to eat and drink and had a bit more. Then he went for 40 days and 40 nights down through the Sinai desert, back to the Sinai mountain range where Moses had been, and back up onto Mount Horeb. No one had been there since Moses was there. Elijah must have known that. He must have known that he was the only one to have set foot on the Mount of God where God's presence was revealed to Moses. And he must have thought, there's a reason for me being sent here. I've been directed. Here I am. And he was there on that mountain, and he must have been full of the feeling of what it would have been like for Moses. I wonder, was he in the same cleft of the rock that Moses hid in? And when Moses there, the earthquake, wind and fire devoured the Mount Horeb. The mount shook with an earthquake so the rocks came tumbling down, the blast of the wind and the trumpets, and a column of fire over the mountain. And God made a covenant with his people. He made a promise and a covenant with them. He took Israel as his bride. And on that mountain, what he did with Israel was to promise to her the same promise every husband makes to the wife. I will nurture you, I will care for you, I will protect you. God promised to bring Israel into a land flowing with milk and honey, a land where they would be looked after, protected, saved from marauding nations around. And he only asked for one thing in return. He asked for faithfulness, fidelity. And it was the one thing Israel was not prepared to give. Elijah knew all this. He knew that the earthquake, wind and fire had been the symbol of that covenant. And here he was in the same position where Moses was. And he looks around and there's an earthquake again and the place shakes. I don't know how bad it was, but it must have shaken considerably, and there was a rushing of wind and there was the fire, and he must have thought, here I am experiencing the same thing Moses experienced. But God wasn't in it. What was God saying by giving him exactly the same symbols that Moses had? But this time God was not in those symbols. But what God was saying is that covenant was gone. God was saying to him, I've finished with Israel. I made a promise with them at Mount Sinai, and they've ratted on me over and over and over again. I've just had enough. And the covenant is now finished. Now I'll turn my attention, my love and my grace on the 7,000 who have not bowed down to Baal. It won't be about the nation anymore. It'll be about those who love me. And from this point onward, Elijah witnesses the grace of God going out to the Gentiles. From this point onward, starting with the jobs that Elijah had to do, God was going to illustrate that his grace was going to become moving out from Israel, moving through the nations. It was from this point onward that the nations around began to experience the blessings of God. Elijah was given 3 jobs. God said, get up, dust yourself off. 3 jobs you've got to do. Number 1, I want you to appoint Elisha to be the prophet after you. Number 2, I want you to appoint Jehu to be the king of Israel. Number 3, I want you to appoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Well, first of all, if you look and read carefully, you'll find that Elijah never did those jobs. He did one of them. He appointed Elisha. He never did appoint Jehu to be king over Israel, and he never did anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Why did God give him 3 jobs he knew he couldn't do or wouldn't do before God took him? That's a question for another time. Okay, Elijah now can see that God's influence is now moving up to the Syrians. God says, I want you to appoint a Syrian king. What has God got to do with Syrian kings? Well, he has now. From this point onward, the word of God begins to spread out to the Gentiles. Later, Jonah was to go to Nineveh to bring the gospel of grace to them, that they might be saved. Nahum was to go to Nineveh to bring the gospel of grace to them again. The word of God began to go to kings outside of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar received images and visions from God. Perhaps the greatest prophetic vision ever given was given to King Nebuchadnezzar. It was Daniel who interpreted, but Nebuchadnezzar was the one who received the image, or well, the vision of the image. King Cyrus was used as an instrument of God. Pharaoh of Egypt brought God's message to Josiah. Why didn't God speak to Josiah? The light that was to lighten the Gentiles was to see its fullness in Jesus, but it had started because God was finished with Israel. As he said in the 3rd chapter of Jeremiah, I wrote her a bill of divorcement out in the desert, and I got rid of her like a faithless wife. And so this was the position now that Elijah found himself in. Elijah at this point was connected to Moses. This connection was going to go on through the rest of the Bible. This connection between Moses and Elijah was to continue onto the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. There was Moses and Elijah because they had been united back at Horeb. And they turn up again in Revelation 11. If you look at the 2 witnesses in Revelation, one has the power to turn water into blood and bring plagues upon the earth. Not too hard to figure that out, who it is. And the other one had the power to stop the rain falling on the earth for 3.5 years. Not too hard to figure that one. Elijah and Moses from this point onward were linked. Jesus picked up the same symbol. Jesus says very early in his ministries, Luke chapter 4, he said, I tell you that there were many widows in the time of Elijah, but he was sent to none of them except a Lebanese widow. And I tell you that there were many, many lepers in the time of Elisha, but Elisha was sent to none of them except Naaman the Syrian. And the Jewish people tried to kill Jesus because they could see what he was saying. The message had gone to the Gentiles. And that was this message that the prophets were burdened with. The prophets had in their earthen vessels this message of God to take to the Gentiles. And now we come to Elisha. Elisha, the greater prophet than Elijah. Elisha was a symbol of Jesus. Elijah was the forerunner, like John the Baptist was the forerunner, but Elisha was the image of Jesus. He did all the miracles, well, not all of the miracles, but many of the miracles of Jesus. He opened the eyes of the blind. He fed a crowd with a handful of bread. He raised the dead back to life, and the greatest miracle that Elisha executed was when he was already dead himself. He brought life out of the grave. When the dead body the people were carrying was thrown into the grave of Elisha and it touched the bones of Elisha, it stood up and walked out, symbolizing forever the resurrection of the dead because of the death of Jesus Christ. It's because of his death, his sacrifice and his resurrection that we can live again. And Elisha had all of that. That's what he was armed with. And then a message came to him from the king of Syria. King Ben-Hadad was sick, and it seemed that he might die. And so he said to his servant Hazael, go down to the man of God in Israel and ask him, will I get better from this disease? Have you ever wondered why Ben-Hadad decided to go and ask the man of God? Didn't the Syrians have temples to their gods? Yes, they did. Didn't they have gods that they worshipped? Yes, of course they did. Why would he go to the man of God in Israel? Because the light had been going out to the Gentiles. He had already experienced the power of Yahweh the King, or the Lord of Israel. He had already experienced that through his servant Naaman, who had been cured of leprosy. No God can cure leprosy except the God of Israel. And so Ben-Hadad turns to the God of Israel. And he sends his servant Hazael to speak to Elisha, and Elisha looks at him and he starts to cry. And Hazael says, why are you crying? And Elisha says, because I know the terrible things you will do to my people of Israel. I know that you will kill the young men, you'll rape the women, tear up the women with child, beat the heads of the babies against the rocks. All of these things you'll do because you're a chosen instrument. Hazael says, why? What am I? I'm just a dog. Elisha says, you have been chosen to be the king of Israel. The king of Syria. You've been chosen to be the king of Syria. God has picked you. And of course, when he went back, he murdered Ben-Hadad, and so he became king. Have you ever thought of the opportunity that Elisha missed there? Elisha was totally consumed with his own people. He was totally consumed with the welfare of Israel. These were the very people God had said, my covenant is over. All he could think of was the terrible things that were going to happen to Israel. Oh, poor Israel. How different the story might have been if he had stood in front of Hazael and grabbed him by the lapel and said to him, Hazael, you have been picked by the God of the universe. You've been chosen by God to be the king of Syria. You could be the greatest king the world has ever known. Submit yourself to this Lord. Submit yourself to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and he will guard you and guide you, and you will come into glory. Elisha could have used this occasion to pronounce the light going to the Gentiles. He could have made it a wonderful thing, but he didn't. He just wallowed in his own misery. Now I want to tell you about somebody who saw further than Elisha ever did. In the second book of Kings, chapter 5, we read the story of Naaman. And Naaman had a little servant girl. It says she was a young maid. That's very non-specific. In Hebrew, we don't know how old she was, but there's a couple of clues. The first thing is she must have been a fairly recent captive because she was totally aware of Elisha and his abilities through the Spirit of God. She knew about Elisha. She knew what he could do. She knew the miracles that he could perform. So had she been taken captive as a 1 or 2-year-old and raised in the house of the Syrian, she would have had no idea of what Elisha could do. So she must have been a recent captive. I probably think she was about 9, 10 or 11. Had she been much older, had she been 13 or 14, I expect she would have been used for sex. So basically, as a serving girl, that's the age I'll sort of put her. So she's only been recently taken. It tells us that a band of Syrians went raiding and they destroyed an Israeli, not even Jewish, a city of Israel. They actually took these captives after they had destroyed this village. So imagine the last thing she's seen. She probably saw her father defend the village and fall under the sword, probably disemboweled in front of her. She probably witnessed her mother being dragged out of a tent or a hut and being raped in front of her and then having her throat cut. She would have witnessed the most horrible things done by the Syrians. And here she is taken as a captive back to serve the very people who had done this. And can you imagine how she might have felt when this man, if it wasn't him personally, he had been the general in charge of these atrocities, when he gets leprosy? How do you reckon she felt? Yes, God, thank you. You can imagine she would have thought, man, I could just watch the flesh fall off him. I'm going to watch this guy die in agony. And what did she do? She put her hand out and she picked up a lamp and she carried the light to the Gentiles. The very thing Elisha missed. She took the message of God and she said, there is a man in Israel who can save you. And that message has gone out for the last 2,000 years. There was a man in Israel, and now he's in heaven, who can save every one of us. And that little girl had more understanding of the grace of God and the light to lighten the Gentiles than Elisha ever had. So don't tell me we can't do what the prophets have done or the greats of the past have done. Every one of us can take that light and we can take it to the Gentiles of our age. Elisha was a type of Jesus Christ, and so are you and I. We're Jesus Christ to a dark world. And that's our commitment for 2018. That's where we ought to be headed. And if in the grace of God we find ourselves in his kingdom, don't you want to give that little girl a hug? Oh, I'd love to put my arms around her and just give her a hug and say, I saw in you the power of the light that lightened the Gentiles. Didn't see it in Elisha, I saw it in you. So there's my thought for 2018, and I'll see if I can turn this off.